It's estimated that over 11 million illegal immigrants currently reside within the borders of the United States, and often the first question that gets asked is, how do we stop more from coming? Concern, of course, is valid. In 2014, 80,000 kids from countries like El Salvador and Honduras made the journey from their home countries to come to live in America, fleeing in search of their parents or just in search of a better life. In that same year, the Obama administration deported over 400,000 unauthorized immigrants, according to a Pew Research Organization poll. Even though deportations had declined in total that year, it was still nearing the all-time high for our country. ICE Immigrations and Customs Enforcement estimate that in 2016 it cost roughly $1,978 to deport each illegal immigrant, which means that we are currently spending approximately $791,200,000 deporting immigrants each year.
Well, first of all, they're not rounding anyone up. The people that ICE apprehend are people who are illegal and then some.
I'm here to argue that this is not the first question we should ask. When you diagnose a problem, for example, the symptoms can help you identify what the problem is, but treating the symptoms will only bring comfort. It cannot cure the disease. If mass immigration is a symptom of a problem, then what is the cause? The cause is prohibition. The prohibition started with Lyman Beecher, a Presbyterian minister and father of 13. In 1828, he wrote and delivered the 6 Sermons of Intemperance. By the time this sermon was delivered, cases of alcohol dependence and addiction were growing in America. Mark Twain once said, "I always take Scotch whiskey at night as a preventative of toothache. I've never had the toothache, and what is more, I never intend to have it." The 6 Sermons was an attempt to drain the dirty swamp of American culture. At the time, domestic abuse ran rampant in a time when there were no laws regarding domestic violence, and it wasn't uncommon to see women sporting bruises and black eyes. The church was instrumental in cleaning up communities at the time, setting up clinics designed to dry out alcohol-dependent folk and setting up groups of total abstinence to keep people on the path to God. But how did this all start? Before Prohibition, most people drank. It used to be that in the 1800s, when the bell struck at a certain time, it was grog time, a time for factory workers and laborers to take a break with a drink. Alcohol was, in a way, a ritual of American life. Often Americans would wake up with a little shot of rum in their coffee, and for the most part, beer was what most people drank. This beer was weak, about 2% alcohol at the time. So the amount of beer that people drank would be considered excess today, but normal at the time. Then a drastic shift took hold. Whiskey production became more prevalent, and because whiskey was stronger and people were used to drinking weak beer, people drank far more than was healthy because it took society a while to catch up to the science of ethanol. As a result, ethanol dependence became a serious problem, and in the 19th century, Americans outdrank their 21st century counterparts by 3 times as much. Alcohol was taking away people's lives and livelihoods. Domestic violence was commonplace, and because there was no way out for these women, they often lived in silence. Then in 1828, a Presbyterian movement started called temperance. It stated that through God, anyone could find redemption. The same group defamed any independent group that started to treat alcoholics like the Washingtonians, for example, stating that no man can be free of wickedness without the help of God. The group started mildly by banning whiskey at their masses and meetings, but later called for total abstinence of all parishioners. Many independent church groups began springing up, like the Sons of Temperance, the Royal Templars of Temperance, and the United Order of the Golden Cross. Children were enlisted and took the vow of abstinence as a part of the Cold Water Army. These same temperance movement groups were involved in other pursuits such as abolishing slavery. The call of the day was to save souls through the abolition of the substance which was tearing their communities apart. The movement was never about creating law. Abstinence was voluntary, but reformers began lobbying to have bars and restaurants shut down in an effort to kill the drink, and to do this, they formed together to create powerful groups to pressure both the government and the citizenry into change. In 1851, Neil Dow, the wealthy mayor of Maine, gathered signatures for a petition banning the sale of alcohol. The bill was passed, which was the first time a state ever voted to ban a beverage. With raids on liquor sales becoming more frequent, it seemed that the war on alcohol was working until bootleggers and smugglers began pouring into Maine to make a profit. Then the Civil War killed it all. The women's suffrage movement was busy shutting down bars and attempting to get legislation passed to allow women the ability to vote so that their voice could be heard in government. They lobbied to get indoctrinating language about alcohol into school textbooks and even demanded kickbacks from the government. A movement that started with good intentions was beginning to resemble something else entirely, a thing looking for nothing more than to maintain its own power. In spite of all this, 300,000 saloons opened up all over America, showing that people wanted to drink. It was integral to their lives. Prohibition seemed to be losing traction. The anti-saloon movement became the first powerful government lobbying group that sought to do nothing more than shut down the saloons. They turned out reams of propaganda and held large rallies, putting pressure on the politicians like no other group before it. On December 10th, 1913, a mass march was heading towards the Capitol. The Anti-Saloon League and Women's League were marching to win a constitutional amendment banning alcohol. Believing that alcohol was undermining the success of America, the support for an amendment change was gaining support, and with 17 states under dry state laws, prohibition seemed inevitable given enough time. And World War I gave the Anti-Saloon League the ammo it needed to shut down the mostly German-owned breweries. In 1920, the 18th Amendment went into effect and changed America. It had been a victory for God-fearing country folk, but now that one of the largest industries in America was deemed illegal, what would become of all the now unemployed immigrants and working poor? They turned mostly to the illicit underground of bootlegging and rum running. In Chicago, mass bandits hijacked trains and trucks full of bourbon and whiskey, and thus began the era of rum running and bootlegging. The underground alcohol market was beginning. Bootlegging started almost the very moment the amendment passed, opening up a market that was untapped. Among them was George Remus, who bought up the factories that would act as a front for his illegal distilleries, and even went so far as to buy up transportation companies in order to utilize them to transport his whiskey. It was as much of an industry as producing cars, but with the sharp difference between them being that the liquor industry only dealt in cash and didn't pay taxes. Then, in order to further solidify his hold on the business and ensure against losses from government seizures, he set up secret meetings with Jess Smith, a member of the Ohio Gang, who had the ear of Warren G. Harding at the time. Smith guaranteed George Remus could have as many federal withdrawal permits as he wanted for $2.50 per case, and for $50,000, Remus could get immunity from prosecution. George Remus paid in cash. Rum runners used any means they could utilize to traffic whiskey. By land, by sea, and it wasn't difficult to get the product to port when the criminals had much better and faster transportation than the police and coast guards. When Al Capone took to the scene, he and his gang managed to buy off officials, intimidate voters, and stay in relative safety with a cadre of police bodyguards. The common tactic of Prohibition-era gangsters was to seize power through bribes and intimidation to get the rest. According to studies at the time, Prohibition did not decrease the use of alcohol, and in fact, the use had gone up, as did cases of cirrhosis of the liver. In fact, the U.S. Bureau of Census released data showing that from 1920, the year the amendment passed, to 1930, the year Prohibition ended, the murder rate had climbed from 6.8% to, at its height, nearly 10%. The prison population rose as well, and dramatically. Sing Sing was host to about 1,100 inmates, and by 1920 grew to 1,500, and later in 1922 to well over 1,600. It seems that Prohibition, a virtuous religious crusade against the evils of alcohol, failed in its primary purpose to improve the morals and health of American citizens. According to the same census data, once Prohibition ended, the murder rate, crime rate, and so on returned to pre-Prohibition rates once the gangs were starved of their revenue, and with most of their leaders either in prison or dead, the remnants of rum runners and Prohibition gangs turned to loan sharking, and with the prohibition of opium in the early 1900s, American gangsters were about to get very familiar with the Mexican cartels. When the Harrison Act passed in 1914, opium became illegal to produce in the United States. As a result, the Chinese moved to Mexico and brought poppies and thus opium with them, as it was not yet illegal there. Before that, there was arid land at the top of hills and valleys in the Sierra Madre where no good crops would grow, at least not profitable ones. According to the book El Narco, when the Chinese brought their drugs, it was at a time when the average Mexican citizen saw marijuana use as something dirty and inappropriate. They saw opium use as something that made you lazy. In general, they didn't have a good opinion of the Chinese or the drugs that they brought with them. From 1922 to 1927, the Chinese immigrants in Mexico were targets of anti-Chinese sentiment. and hate groups which painted signs showing Chinese folk as being responsible for rat infestations and accused them of being without hygiene. Soon the very Chinese that grew the poppies in Mexico and in a sense helped Mexican cultivation of opium were rounded up and in most cases murdered and driven from the country. This mass exodus also coincided with the rise of a particularly powerful drug lord called La Nacha, and the Chinese property and land was divided amongst the various families who were now in charge of opium farming. A tale that the Sinaloans like to tell is that during the Great War, America came and knocked on Mexico's door. They came hat in hand, and in that hat was enough cash to buy up a field's worth of opium. The Sinaloans were happy to oblige, of course. This tale is so common that it is treated as a part of Mexico's history. The 1940s were good to the Sinaloan poppy farmer. The need for pain medication was at an all-time high, with World War II being fought overseas. The governments of foreign countries were steady, well-paying customers. The Mexican government turned a blind eye to the activity until the families that were growing the opium turned violent and seemed to flout the law. The PRI, also known as the Institutional Revolutionary Party, set out to teach the families they were in charge and rounded up farmers and dealers alike, tortured, imprisoned, and at times murdered them, just to teach a lesson, and almost as immediately as the burst of violence occurred, the government went back to turning a blind eye to the drug trade, both benefiting economically from the trade while being able to deny its own culpability. Because of this vulnerability, the families slowly began to forget their differences, clans were soon formed, alliances were being made, and power and wealth were being hoarded. And then came the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970, and the shift in focus from marijuana and opium to cocaine, and the formation of the cartels. Demand for marijuana skyrocketed in the States in the hippie-dominated freak-out culture of the 60s, and because of this, it became a major crop in the Mexican countryside. The impact of the American market was felt throughout many South and Central American countries, including Colombia, a soon-to-be rival. Mexico's small industry wasn't able to keep up with the demand, so more farms propped up. And since marijuana was such an easy crop to grow in the Mexican countryside climate, and because it sold for a higher price than, say, limes or avocados, the choice was clear for farmers. Then Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs, which gave birth to the first cartels. 1968 was to be a big year for Mexico. With the Olympics to be hosted in Mexico City, the president at the time, Gustavo Diaz Ordaz, invested vast amounts of money to prepare, all while tensions with labor unions and guerrillas and student activists were flaring up. Tlatelolco Plaza was the site of a massacre of student protesters. PRI government snipers gunned down the students to the tune of 400, though the actual number of dead has yet to be confirmed. It is believed that over 1,300 students were arrested, tortured, and even murdered.
No sé si el balazo venía de allá o venía de aquí, no me di cuenta o de allá. El hecho es que aquí cayó, aquí. Ay, es lo más tremendo de mi vida.
This is the Dirty War, a subject very few people outside the country know about. When the leftist parties were legalized in 1978, most of the prisoners arrested for protesting and other political crimes were set free, but after several years of torture and inhumane treatment, these men and women would not have easily been able to forget that what was done to them. All would not be forgiven. Many found themselves joining the cartels. The Mexican government and the American DEA cooperated on many takedowns of prominent figures, and with the America drug war and the president putting pressure on Mexico to act, violence, torture, and crop burnings were routine. So it should be no surprise that in 1988, one of the most powerful cartels formed to take over the trafficking of drugs and to push back or buy off the forces of the Mexican government. You may know them as the Sinaloa Cartel. Around this same time, the territories of Juarez, Tijuana, and Guadalajara were divided up amongst competing cartels which kicked off decades of bloodshed. La Familia de Michoacan are a unique case in the cartel world. They're not just a cartel, they hold more in common with a cult. The family has laws that seem to come from a religious standpoint or twisted to fit the needs of terrible men. The book Salvaje de Corazon, or Wild at Heart, a book written by a Christian by the name of John Eldridge, is required reading for all potential family members and has even gone so far as to bribe teachers to teach the book in schools. Gonzalez Moreno has twisted evangelic thought to indoctrinate youth who are at times uneducated and unable to muster a defense against it. Their primary export was meth, cocaine, and opium. Perhaps as a byproduct of the proximity and availability of these drugs, the street-level dealers and enforcers were reported by victims to always be drunk or drugged, seeming crazy and on the verge of frenzy. From this family of ideologies came the Knights Templar, a sort of enforcement branch of the cartel, which broke from the family and began taking over towns, extorting the locals, and murdering those who either couldn't afford or refused to pay protection money. I say this group is unique for they can often be seen wearing ceremonial robes, not unlike the original knights from which they have their name. Wearing chainmail suits, wielding Spanish ceremonial swords, it all seems like theater until you hear about their methods of murder. When a person refuses to pay, they often kidnap the family, torture, behead, vivisect, and by some reports, burn alive their victims. Here is one story of their atrocities.
Cierro los ojos y los sueño, cómo los hicieron. Los templarios, pues a mi esposo lo llevaron porque era de autodefensa. Nos pedían dinero por él. Entregamos dinero, pero no lo entregaron. Ya después, como a la semana, y me levantaron y me llevaron. Pues sí lloraba yo al verlo a él ahí, y él también lloraba al mirarme él a mí, porque él pensó que me iban a matar a mí también junto con él. Los templarios, ellos siempre se la pasaban drogados, borrachos. Mi esposo, primero lo quemaban con un soplete, vivo. Y después de eso, llegan con 4 personas. Pues primero mataban de uno por uno. Les mocharon las cabezas, las manos, las piernas, todos los hicieron en pedacitos. Se agarraban como locos riéndose y les daba alegría a ellos. Unas fosas ya estaban hechas. Después de que a ellos los aventaron ahí, también me aventaron junto con ellos. Ya después hechos, ahí jugaron conmigo, se divirtieron, hicieron lo que hicieron. Pues a mí me soltaron y le dicen el chaneque. Dijeron que no me iban a matar por lo que ya había mirado. Era un castigo. Y que con eso era bastante para sufrir toda mi vida y que iba a quedar loca.
From this was born a vigilante group calling themselves La Autodefensas de Michoacán, a group of farmers and workers from the towns under siege from the group. They armed themselves and managed to drive out the cartels from most of the southern villages in Michoacán. But like with most things in Mexico, this group fell into the hands of infiltrating cartels and were soon taking part in illegal raids and extrajudicial murders.
Cuando tengan la oportunidad, porque nunca han tenido compasión de nadie, jamás, nunca. Confiesen todo lo que puedan sacarle y entierren inmediatamente.
Soon the president of Mexico in 2014 called for the disarmament and arrest of the Autodefensas key members who refused to give up their weapons, and absorbed the rest, the remaining members, into the federal and local police force. From here, the corruption continued. In 2012, Mexico reported a murder rate of 21 per capita. This number is largely touted as underreported as the government has shifted the numbers by declaring some murders accidental deaths. In May of this year, Mexico reported over 2,000 murders that month alone, in which many of the murder cases investigated were multiple homicides and mostly against civilians not involved with the drug trade. Frontline reported that since 2007 to 2014, the total number of cartel-related homicides reached over 164,345, far surpassing the total deaths reported in both Iraq and Afghanistan at the same time combined. That is an average of 23,000 deaths a year. For contrast, the United States, which has a population almost triple that of Mexico, boasted from 2007 to 2014 an average of 15,000 murders a year, with a murder rate hovering at about 6%. Corruption in Mexico is so widespread that drugs are the country's unofficial export. The cartel's strategy used to be to pay off police, the police chiefs, politicians, all local forms of law enforcement, so that they would have free reign to do as they please. If the cartel stepped too far out of line, the government used to be able to push them back with extreme violence and torture. But the documentary Cartel Land has shown the corruption is so deep and the cartels dug into the land like ticks that the government and police forces no longer have the power or the will to do anything about it. The cartels fit the very definition of an insurgent terrorist force. To believe otherwise is to either be woefully misinformed or to be wearing blinders at a conflict. As I said earlier, the problems we face in this country with immigration are a direct result of a war in Mexico being waged against the people by a group of powerful drug cartels which exist for profit and extract that profit through extortion and murder. The cartels may have more in common with groups like ISIS than one might suggest from cursory glances, but I intend to examine these two groups and see how many similarities they share and ask the question, are cartels a terrorist group? Opium. Opium is the drug that the Taliban used to buy its way through a war with America, and it is said that the opium that comes from groups like the Taliban and ISIS cultivates about 50% of the world's heroin. Let's look at the history of the drug trade in the Middle East, and in particular Afghanistan's role in all of it all. According to an article from the Middle East Institute by John Calabrese, in 1911, Iran drafted and passed the first law designed to limit the opium trade coming from Afghanistan. Within a decade, the government began handing out ration tickets as the opium addiction rate in the country continued to rise. The government of Iran seemingly eased up on the promise to limit the production of poppy and began to impose levies on the exports, effectively legitimizing the drug trade. And this wouldn't be the first time that Iran has changed its position on the drug trade from punishment to regulation. Throughout the 1920s, Iran trade in opium grew to account for over a quarter of its gross domestic product, until 1928 when international pressure mounted to curb the trade as opium addiction rose throughout the Middle East and Europe. Even with this pressure mounting, the cultivation of land for use in opium production grew. The 1955 law on prohibition of opium cultivation and production had the opposite of the intended effect. Instead of culling opium and helping the country deal with its opium addiction problem, opium cultivation spread throughout Afghanistan and Pakistan. The heroin and morphine produced in these countries found its way back into the Iranian community, and with the prohibition on the drugs, the price rose, and so did its profitability. Iran once again faltered, and in the 1960s, the Shah eased up on the ban and permitted the resumption of opium production in designated areas under state supervision, while at the same time making smuggling a death sentence. But in the 1970s, the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, reached an agreement with the Baruchi clan, whereby the clan would forego trafficking in exchange for government cash benefits. And the revolution in Iran broke their agreement, and the relationship between the Tehran and Baluchi clans deteriorated into violence. One can draw many parallels between the clans of Iran and the Baluchistan and the various cartels in Mexico. Throughout the 1990s, poppy and opium cultivation flourished in the arid lands of Afghanistan, and as such, so did the profits. And from this developed clans which were used to secure the northern and southern routes into Iran, and from here, the drugs took the Balkan route to Western Europe. Then in the year 2000, the Taliban did something unusual. They enacted a countrywide ban in Afghanistan on opium production. Violation of this law was punishable by death. The very same Taliban we went to war with after the 2001 September 11th attacks. As a result, the production of opium fell to a low of 145 metric tons. For contrast, the country produced over 4,500 metric tons in the year 2000 before the ban. After the Afghanistan war stabilized in 2002, the production of opium shot up to previous levels to around 4,300 metric tons. Quoting from the 2017 article from Dave Gibson titled "Afghan Opium Production Has Flourished Under U.S. Occupation," the Taliban had relied on opium sales to finance their operations until July 2000. It was then that the regime's leader, Mullah Muhammad Omar, issued a ban on the drug trade because he claimed that it conflicted with Islamic law. Less than a year later, the United Nations delegation visited the areas of the country where poppies were traditionally grown and found nothing. There are no poppies, it's amazing, the former head of the UN drug control program, Antonia Maria Costa, said. End quote. 2002, according to data, was the highest production of opium since the 2000 ban and coincides with the 2002 US and NATO-backed worldwide ban on opium production. Quoting from the same article, in March 2002, a US foreign intelligence official speaking on the condition of anonymity reminded a reporter with Newsmax of the CIA's record of involvement with the international drug trade. The CIA did almost the identical thing during the Vietnam War, which had catastrophic consequences. The increase in the heroin trade in the US beginning in the 1970s is directly attributable to the CIA. The CIA has been complicit in the global drug trade for years, so I guess they just want to carry on their favorite business. The sole reason why organized crime groups and terrorists have the power that they do is all because of drug trafficking. Like the old saying goes, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. End quote. As with any anonymous source, caution is advised, but CIA involvement is verifiable through classified documents dealing with groups like FARC and the Contra scandal. In 2003, after the removal of Saddam Hussein, Iraq became another route for drugs coming out of Iran. According to Hamid Ghozi, president of the International Narcotics Control Board, drug traffickers have entered Iraq via Iran. Sometimes disguised as pilgrims, they have set up operations in the holy cities of Najaf and Karbala, smuggling opiates into and through Jordan. Media in the United Kingdom, drawing on accounts provided by British troops stationed in the south, have reported drug smuggling operations routed through Basra as well. In 2006, the production of opium rose 59% to 6,500 metric tons. And in 2007, the Kurdish and Azeri mafias secured the trafficking routes. Bringing us back to where we are now in Afghanistan. Since the troop withdrawal by American forces, ISIS and Taliban have increased their influence throughout the country, and the two groups currently produce up to 50% of the world's poppy. It very well may explain why both groups currently hold territory where the opium production is centered. This map shows the current areas where opium production is at its highest. This map is a map of the territory currently held by both groups. If we overlay both of these maps, we could see that they have secured most of the areas where opium is produced, and that is where most of their power is concentrated. In other areas, we could draw a map to trade routes with neighboring countries. With ISIS controlling much of Afghanistan's opium-rich lands, the eradication of opium farms has decreased by 91% in 2016, according to a UNDOC paper titled Afghanistan Opium Survey. This data was verified through satellite imaging of the area, mostly of the Badakistan province. In 2016, the UNDOC released the Sustainable Development and Opium Production Environment. In it, they state, and I quote, "The economic impact of illicit drug cultivation and production economic development in Afghanistan, one of the poorest countries worldwide, is multifaceted. Opiates have created an economy based on illicit activities that in many provinces have permeated the rural society to the extent that many communities, not only farmers, have become dependent on the income from opium poppy to sustain their livelihoods. The illicit economy discourages private and public investment by fueling insecurity, violence, and insurgency, and creates costs associated with the consumption of opiates for individual drug users and their families, and for the society in general." End quote. Some reports say that as much as 16% of Afghanistan's GDP comes from opium and the opiate-derived market. This may explain why in 2007, Myanmar, one of the second largest opium environments on the planet, and Afghanistan, the current king, are attempting to push a bill through the India Department of Commerce for extending its refinement of opium for use in legal drugs. Coincidentally, AstraZeneca, GlaxoSmithKline, and Merck all have offices in India, and from the job boards of Merck, there are even job openings for formulation scientists. In India alone, Merck appears to have up to 4 offices, but more may be present. If America has outlawed the growing and use of opium, where do these drug companies get their opium for use in morphine? India is the major producer of opium to be used in opiates like morphine. So it reasons that the drug companies, unable to grow it themselves, would have to seek outside help, but in taking this out of the country, They would also have a vested interest in ensuring that opium supplies are steady. This graph shows the GDP growth in the agricultural sector in Afghanistan. It rises in correlation with the rise in opium harvests. This illicit money is then reinvested into the community by supporting small shops taxed and invested into infrastructure, which has helped also grow the licit money gained through legal ventures. The UNDOC attempted to create an alternative for the farmer aside from opium, but they have yet to come up with anything viable. With all the struggles the country faces right now, the issue of reform becomes difficult, especially when the most powerful and terrifying group of people in the nation are also providing its means of growth. The New Yorker in 2016 published an article that states, "But here in one of the few corners of Helmand province that is peaceful and in firm government control, the green stalks and swollen bulbs of opium were growing thick and high within eyeshot of official buildings during the past poppy season, signs of a local narco state administered directly by government officials. Opium has ostensibly become legal in Helmand provinces, with the government taxing farmers much like how the Taliban does it in areas they control. It is not spoken of freely, but those speaking on a condition of anonymity say that, 'Of course it happens here,' said a police commander in Maharaja Bazgul. But the local police chief, the local police commander, they don't take the money directly, they do it through influential figures. In Garmsir, the taxes on opium have become a major source of money for education, infrastructure, and security. This money also fuels the war between the three ruling clans of Afghanistan, between ISIS, the Taliban, and the government. They seem to have more in common with drug cartels than they do warring factions." So does religious extremism play a part in all of this? Well, yeah, but probably not in the capacity that we all think. It's more of an indoctrinating method, the thing that gets people who are passionate about their home country and their religion into the fight. Religion is a recruitment tool, just like it is with the Michoacan and the Knights Templar. So what are the solutions? Well, you've probably heard the term, there's more than one way to skin a cat. Well, the disease that's ravaging Mexico can be solved in many ways, but the most effective way to destroy a violent and bloody mafia or any criminal organization is to force it to become legit through legalizing its product. In an article on the Monterey attack by BBC's Julian Migliani writes, "The attack in Monterey also sparked a call by Mexican President Mr. Calderon's predecessor, Vicente Fox, for the government to consider agreeing to a ceasefire with the drug gangs, possibly the first time such a senior politician has openly broached that possibility. Mr. Fox, who belongs to Mr. Calderon's National Action Party, said that a group of experts should be summoned that could invite violent groups to a truce and assess the convenience of an amnesty law. The current administration sharply rejected Mr. Fox's call and vowed to continue fighting the drug gangs through legal persecution and the security forces." End quote. Rarity is profit. When something is rare, the demand goes up. The same is just as true for gold and diamonds as it is for water and gas. As we talked about it in the Prohibition era, alcohol became gold because it became rare, and not only rare, but dangerous to get a hold of. The people willing to risk their lives and freedom needed to be paid commensurate with the work they put in. As such, rum runners became rich, while bodies around the industry piled up. When alcohol was once again legitimized and your average American could buy it in a store or in a bar, there was no need for the black market, so those in the rum running industry went straight. The most prominent of these figures are the political powerhouse family of the Kennedys, who started out as rum runners and bootleggers until they left the business when they had enough money to get into politics. One way to crush the cartels is to legalize their activity. It has been suggested by some that ending the drug war would end the violence. This would hit the cartels in the pocketbook in a hard way, but it isn't enough. The government of Mexico is complicit in the industry. As long as the Mexican government is sleeping with the enemy, not even the legalization of the drug in America will stop the cartels from extortion and murder, so long as it is relatively safe for them to do so. So my eyes turn back to the border. The people crossing the river, hopping the fences, walking the desert, hoping that they can get to their families out one day before they are victimized by crime or an uncaring, complicit government. What about them? Would a wall 30 feet high keep out those desperate to escape death in wartime? Should we get involved? Shouldn't we legitimately call those very same people refugees? As long as the problem of Mexico is framed only in the light of economics, jobs, and welfare, not only will we continue to fail to see the real problems Mexico faces, but we will fail to destroy the disease ravaging their country and ours.
All right, hold on. Let me just ask you a question. Why are you guys bloods? Why are you in the gangs?
Police say a black SUV pulled up to a home where people were gathered out front. Someone inside that vehicle then opened fire on the group. 4 people were hit, 2 were hit in the chest and back, and were pronounced dead at the scene.